As we go to air tonight, right now, the global experts on climate change are releasing a landmark report on how our use of land is affecting the climate. It's a special new report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. It's just been published, and it reveals that unprecedented levels of land exploitation are contributing to climate change and simultaneously threatening food security. Professor Mark Howden is director of the ANU's Climate Change Institute. He's vice chair of the IPCC. He's in Geneva.
Good evening, Jonathan.
Evening, Jonathan. Sorry about that.
What a superb outcome. Now, tell us about this IPCC report. What's new in this report? What are we seeing here that we didn't know before about climate change?
Well, one of the key messages is that the climate is changing, and it's changing quickly, and we've known that before. But what it highlights is that the temperature increase over land is about double the global average. So, of course, the land is where we all live and where we get our food from. And so that's having a whole range of impacts, impacting particularly, the report shows, on land degradation and also on greenhouse gas emissions. And so, the land is sort of both suffering from climate change, but it's also a cause of climate change because there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions that come from, for example, our food systems.
There's been a lot of discussion previously about temperature in the world's oceans as being a real indicator of what's going on. Is this a sort of a twist here? Is seeing this land-based temperature rise something new and something of deep concern?
Well, I think it is, and it's going up very quickly. And so the point you make is that the oceans temperature is going up and storing a huge amount of heat in the oceans, but the land is more sensitive. So because the temperature increase can't get absorbed down into the deep oceans, it sort of sits at the soil surface, and so we actually feel it pretty much every day in summer. And so what this is really highlighting is those particularly cropping systems, food systems, are getting impacted quite strongly by this.
And I wonder too, is there a paradox, an awkward and wicked problem here in food systems, in modern mechanisms of agriculture aimed at feeding a galloping world population that are having this unfortunate effect on climate change, exacerbating that effect?
Indeed. So our land systems, that's our vegetation, forests, farms, ecosystems, are both part of the problem, and they're part of the solutions. And so because we depend on them so heavily, we really need to take this quite seriously. So we need to have both good policies which push us towards sustainable land management, but also increasingly good practices that can deal with the climate changes we're experiencing.
I mean, this is clearly a concern globally, but if we look at the Australian example, we have seen in these past couple of years extraordinary drought through much of eastern Australia. By the sound of it, those sorts of conditions are not going to improve rapidly.
No, the projections for Australia and for similar parts of the world are for we're already seeing climate change fingerprints in terms of droughts and water reductions and heat waves and things like that, and they're likely just to get worse over time. So the prospects for Australia are sort of increasing drought risk, increasing risk of low water flows, higher wildfire risks, and the list goes on. And so it's not a particularly great picture for Australia.
And our patterns of land use, what are they doing to contribute to that effect?
Well, across the globe, there still is quite a bit of land clearing, so it's conversion of forests to grasslands or croplands, and that generates a huge amount of carbon dioxide. If we look at, say, our food systems both pre-farm, on-farm and after-farm, that's, transport and processing, produce about 29% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so it's not, these are actually quite large numbers. They're not insignificant numbers. And so what that says is that in terms of meeting things like the Paris Agreement temperature goals, that changing what we do in terms of our land and our food can actually contribute quite significantly. But by itself, it can't solve the climate change problem because the numbers aren't that big. We still have to have reductions in fossil fuel emissions from energy and transport, similar sectors.
And yet there are great opportunities nonetheless in the way we could in future shape agriculture, shape forestry, shape the things that we do with land.
Fundamentally, the management of farms and forests is about how you match your management and your genetics with the environment you experience. And so if the environment changes, you have to change your management or your genetics. And so that's core business. The challenge here is that there's a fair bit of uncertainty in terms of climate from year to year and also from decade to decade, and how we go about managing that. So we need to have further research which actually provides an insight onto that, but also further research in terms of providing options for what we think is going to be a hotter and drier climate in Australia in the future.
How much hotter and drier than we might have expected in the short term?
Oh, well, we've already gone up, as I mentioned before. I think, 1.5 degrees across the land surface, across the globe, and Australia is actually a little bit higher than that. And we're at the moment heading towards a future where, in fact, it may be 4 or more degrees hotter than the historical baseline. And that's a really serious change in our climate. So how serious it is, if you look back at the last ice age, it was about 5 or 6 degrees cooler than our historical climate. So we're actually sort of, what sounds like small numbers, 1.5 or 2 degrees, is actually a very large change in our Earth's climate system.
I mean, I can remember a time in this long conversation around climate change where a 2-degree rise was seen as a cataclysmic endpoint, and we seem to be shifting those goalposts year by year.
Well, we're getting closer to the goalposts year by year, unfortunately. So, at the global scale, we're already about 1 degree above the pre-industrial baseline, and that's accelerating. So things like temperatures going up faster and faster over time, so is sea level, so is atmospheric carbon dioxide. Any of those indicators actually show acceleration rather than slowing down. So we're not really solving the climate problem at the moment.
In your discussions in Geneva this week with other climate change experts, the atmosphere there?
Well, I guess we wouldn't engage in this topic unless there was hope, because we actually think there are solutions here, and they're solutions which bring, win-win prospects for people. So, movements to more sustainable land management, it can increase productivity, increase carbon dioxide's absorption. Carbon sinks in the landscape. Changes in our diets can reduce our greenhouse gas footprint, but also bring health benefits. Reduction of food loss and waste. So about a quarter to a third of food that's grown ends up, in the stomach of an animal or diseased or thrown out from a fridge into a garbage bin. And yet every kilo of that food has to be grown somewhere, and reducing that loss and waste just reduces pressure on our systems. So I think there's lots of sensible win-wins we can actually generate out of this, and we need to think positively about this. So where are the other opportunities associated with climate change? So, for example, new technologies, we could actually be at the forefront in terms of generating new export industries here in Australia, but we've sort of dropped the ball on that.
Perhaps as the pace of this change accelerates and it starts to become a conversation about the growth of food as opposed to more abstract ideas like the rising of sea levels, perhaps that will focus public attention more narrowly on what's going on.
Yeah, look, I actually think the Australian public is pretty keyed into this already. Yep. The last Lowy Institute report showed 90% of Australians wanted more action on climate change. It was rated as the number one threat to Australia's security. So I think Australians know about climate change. What they don't have is a set of options that they can take in their daily lives which actually make things better, nor are they seeing the sort of higher level policies that actually can generate the systemic change that's needed here.
Mark, thanks for your time and early in Geneva. Appreciate you joining us.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Professor Mark Howden is Director of the ANU Climate Change Institute, Vice Chair of the IPCC. A new report out now, that rather chilling as it were, prospect of ever escalating temperatures on land mass, and that'll affect all of us pretty much now.